transitions to the governance of innovations, and most importantly, to the public participation, engagement, and issues about the precautionary principle and the way that in some cases this principle drives out of the arena of the transitions, the public, and the engagement of the public. So, as I said, it is a great honor to have Les with us. Les, the floor is to you, and today Les will talk us about the current condition of COVID-19 and how this changed the concepts and practices in the agri-food sector, particularly in Latin America, with a focus on Brazil. Les, the floor is on you, and thank you once more. It is a great pleasure and honor.
Ευχαριστώ, χαίρομαι πολύ για μένα. So, yeah, I'll bring up the PowerPoint file now. Right, here we are. So the title for today is Constructing a Different Normal Beyond Agri-Modernization, Responses to the COVID-19 Crisis from Brazil's Ecosul Agroecology Agenda, which I will explain. The COVID-19 pandemic led people to look more closely at the sources of pandemics, especially its agro-industrial drivers. Some may have seen a book a long time ago from Mike Davis, The Monster at Our Door. I'm trying to, well, that's it. You can see more of the picture than you did before. Oh, that's even better. And the global threat of avian flu, that was about 15 years ago. A retrospect on several pandemics brought by animals, especially the agri-industrial concentration of animals in the same place. And then more recently, there have been epidemiological studies about how colonization of new frontiers for plunder, for more valuable animals, disrupt pathogens which otherwise would have remained obscure, unknown, and harmless to people, but then those pathogens find new opportunities just to find an entry point into those concentrations of animals and people, and then with our globalized world, they quickly spread to other places, other countries. I mean, and that is a way to tell the story about COVID-19, as well as many previous pandemics. So this has led to greater critical attention on so-called modern agriculture, which has used techno-science for more intensively breeding genetically uniform animals in confined areas, thus increasing the opportunity to generate new pandemics. These systems fragment the countryside and degrade ecosystems. Pathogens encounter no natural barriers, such as biological control agents, which previously contained them. Another aspect of the pandemic has been a generalized public fear. To protect themselves from uncertain threats, many people have retreated into private spaces. They substitute computer or telephone screens for human contact. given the potential for infection, and a largely unknown or unknowable infection, as this article says, passers-by easily become a generalized threat, no matter who they are or where they come from. So given this widespread fear, publics have generally accepted the need for strong state actions, with some ambiguity between which actions are authoritarian and which are beneficent. So it becomes a pretext for imposing ulterior motives, political agendas to control people for other reasons than protecting them. At the same time, there's been a great rise in mutual aid activities, such as an initiative in Britain called Sustainable Food Project. They made great efforts to keep market open by providing the hygiene materials necessary to avoid spreading the infection. There have been initiatives to provide assistance for people who may be isolated or ill or especially vulnerable to infection, assistance so that they receive the protective equipment and regular deliveries of food. This is variously called mutual aid or communitarian networks or solidarity. They provide social proximity, meaning closer relations between people, along with physical distancing, thus helping to overcome or
to the
contain
governance of
fears.
operations, and most importantly, to
Now,
the
let's shift
public
to Brazil,
participation,
where these
engagement,
conflicts
and
take extreme
issues
forms.
about the
The
precautionary
president,
principles and
notorious all over
precautionary
the world,
principle, and the way that
responded to
in some
the
cases
COVID-19
this
pandemic,
principle
which was especially early and
drives out
severe
of the
in
arena
parts of
of the
Brazil,
transitions,
by
the
saying
public
it's just
and
hysteria,
the engagement
it's
of
just a gripezinho,
the public.
the
So,
diminutive form of
as I said,
flu,
it is a
just a
great
minor flu, which will
honor to
pass,
have
harmless
Les
to most people.
with us.
So this intensified people's fears
Les, the
that the
floor
government would do nothing to
is
protect
to
them,
you,
and that
and
it was being
today Les will
dismissed as a way just to continue
talk us
the
about the
right-wing
current
government's
condition
neoliberal
of
austerity agenda,
COVID-19 and how this
continuing to degrade the
change
public
the
sector
concepts and
capacities that could
practices
have
in
protected
the
people.
agri-food sector,
So
particularly in
in
Latin
response,
America,
many
with a
people
focus on
protested
Brazil.
against the
Les,
government
the floor is
in
on
a
you, and thank you once
physically
more.
safe
It is
way
a great
by
pleasure and honor.
simultaneously banging pots and pans from their windows so that everyone could hear the protest in the neighborhood. This became a panelação in many parts of Brazil. I'll bring up the PowerPoint file now. The protests, alongside the mutual aid activities, gave new meanings to a slogan which had originated in Chile the previous year. So the title for today is Constructing a Different Normal Beyond Agri-Modernization, Responses to the COVID-19 Crisis from Brazil's Agroecology Agenda. Slogan was directed at the government's neoliberal austerity agenda. Then the slogan was taken up more widely COVID-19 pandemic since last spring, led people to look more closely at the sources of pandemic, pathogenic, especially production system, especially the agri-food system, which was already causing health problems. A book a long time ago from Mike Davis gave opportunities the monster at our door. Now this became the new context for a research project that was planned last year. You can see more of the picture. It's called Research Partnership for an Agroecology-Based Solidarity Economy, or Agri-Eco, the global threat of avian flu. That was about 15 years ago, funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, coordinated by animals, especially the Agri-Industrial has a South concentration of animals in the same place. And then more recently, there have been epidemiological studies this particular about how colonization of new frontiers for, which I will explain when we come to that part of the story, valuable animals disrupt logo, pathogens, emphasizing which otherwise would have remained role of obscure, unknown, and harmless, and promoting this alternative agenda. Those pathogens find new opportunities just to find an entry point into those according to concentrations of animals people promoting this alternative. The fundamental problem for the last half-century has been the techno-diffusionist model of agricultural modernization. There's a way to tell the story whereby about COVID-19. So-called modernization has shifted farmers' practices towards more complex technological tools and institutional arrangements, seeking a competitive advantage in distant markets and distance more intensively breeding genetically in other countries, uniform animals in confined areas, exporting products to the global north or to wealthy parts of pandemics. So state and corporate structures have planned a societal change that sees farmers and their communities as passive receptacles for new ways to do agriculture, biological control agents, rather than as social actors bringing their own projects, capacities, and trajectories. Another aspect of the pandemic, modernization, a generalized model, public fear, has featured technology packages of the green revolution, protect packaging themselves from uncertain threats. Well, originally hybrid seeds, more recently private spaces, genetically modified seeds, substitute and a range of agrochemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, and machinery to make the harvesting or the planting and then the harvesting a largely unknown or unknowable infection. Now, by contrast, this article says passers-by easily become a generalized threat, no matter who they are or where they come from. Been called for a few decades agroecology. So, given this widespread knowledge, publics have generally accepted the need for strong state actions, with some ambiguity between which actions are environmentally and economically sustainable. Beneficent. These methods reproduce biodiverse seeds, imposing ulterior motives, maintain wider biodiversity for crop resilience for other reasons, for example, than providing ecological spaces for at the same time predators. There's been a great rise so as to avoid the need for pesticides mutual aid activities, and they recycle nutrients, such as especially between plants initiative in animals called sustainable animal waste can be turned into food project organic fertilizers, non-chemical fertilizers. They make great efforts all these methods keep markets open harm and also minimize financial costs for the producers, spreading the infection. In the global south, such traditional methods provide assistance for 70% who may be of local food consumption, or especially vulnerable using much less land than agri-industrial agriculture, which mainly supplies export deliveries of food. We know, and those markets are for this is variously called mutual aid or communitarian networks or solidarity, either for animal feed, social proximity, or for processed food, closer relations between people, or along with physical distancing, thus helping to overcome or contain fears. So the agroecology agenda eventually became grounded in social agrarian agendas and social movements, where these especially in resistance to capitalist modernization, and especially in Latin America. The president, notorious all over the world, became and responded to the counterposed against COVID-19 the dominant, which was economic agenda, early and severe in so-called parts of Brazil, or what we call by saying it's just hysteria. For example, on the left, the banner of La Via Campesina, the form of network of nationally based flu, which will pass and be harmless using these methods. So this intensified people's fears, meaning agroecological, that the government cooled down the earth, by contrast, and that with it was being resource-intensive, carbon-intensive, to continue the right-wing government's industrial neoliberal austerity agenda, heat up the planet, and then continuing to degrade the public sector capacities that could have protected people. WTO, in response, many people protested against the government in a more on the Latin American way by simultaneously the concept economy banging pots and pans from their windows so that everyone could hear the protest lines. It means relationships of mutual aid, reciprocity, cooperation, many parts both within an enterprise and between enterprises, and between the protests, the producers and consumers, alongside the mutual aid activities, gave new meanings to a slogan which had originated in Chile the previous year, where they sometimes use the word circuitos, rather than chains, as in food chain, return to normality, because the circuitos have a broader meaning. Slogan was directed at the government's meaning about solidarity relationships. But we could say then the slogan was taken up more widely throughout better understand and support the production methods on grounds that these are about the whole sustainable, pathogenic, socially equitable production system, especially the agri-food system, collective self-management, which was already causing enterprises health problems. And in the case of Brazil, opportunities for these movements have existed since at least this became the new context. They were seen as central a research project that was planned shaping last year, a post-dictatorship research partnership for an agri-ecology-based solidarity economy, got rid of the agri-ecos, as we call it for short. And finally, funded by the Major Global Challenges Research Fund, with the election coordinated by Partido Trabajadores, the Workers' University, with whom the South American coordination in 2003. Although they didn't have a majority in Parliament, and that became very difficult to pass the necessary legislation. But that's a difference which I will explain when we come to that part of the story. So during those years, here's the logo, governments led by emphasizing and then the prominent role of the government established many support in promoting this alternative agenda. Now, according to the people promoting this alternative, the fundamental problem for the last half century has been the techno-diffusionist model of agricultural modernization, whereby so-called modernization has shifted farmers' practices towards more complex technology with that tools and institutional arrangements, seeking for a while they were advantage in distant markets and distance often ecosol and in other countries, especially eventually they converge, exporting products to the global north or to wealthy parts of in 2011. With that, state and corporate structures have planned a societal change that conceives farmers and their communities as passive receptacles for new ways to do agriculture. And that helped, rather than as social actors, bringing their own projects, capacities, and trajectories with economy and solidarity. And this modernization we call model has featured technology packages of the green revolution. The short food supply featuring well, originally hybrid seeds, more recently genetically modified small-scale seeds, producers, and a range of agrochemicals products for collective marketers and machinery. No, because otherwise the harvesting, totally marginalized planting, and then by any significant buyer. And they were able to do this more effectively through by a new program by the PT government. The alternative has been called for a few decades agri-ecology. Food. These are knowledge-intensive agroecological methods using local available train small-scale producers in the skills socio-environmentally and economically sustainable. These methods reproduce biodiverse seeds, government policies themselves, maintain wider biodiversity for crop resilience, especially for school meals, providing ecological spaces for which natural predators of favorable terms so as to avoid the need for pesticides in the first place. And they recycle nutrients above the conventional price in food markets, plants and animals, food which animal waste is adequately certified as organic or agroecological. Organic fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. So this was a crucial entry point for many cooperatives of small-scale producers, and also minimize financial costs the basis for the producers to In the global south, such traditional methods supply farmers' markets. 70% of local food consumption had the opportunity using make much less personal relationships than agri-industrial agriculture, which mainly supplies export markets. And we know another markets are for the standard commodity well-known grains, such as soya, community-supported agriculture, whereby for either for animal feed, really subscribers, or for processed food, weekly food basket, which varies, of course, with the season, cotton, combination of products that were successfully. So the agroecology agenda eventually became grounded in social agrarian agendas and social movements, especially in resistance to capitalist modernization, and especially in the difficulties, perhaps, of producing food. And go back to our project, it had an alternative. Two main questions against how does the dominant agroecology develop economic capacities for Securitas Cortos, and what methods can help to identify, strengthen, and spread these capacities. For example, on the left, the banner of La Via Campesina. Well, the COVID-19 crisis, of course, pushed us to rethink peasant work, to elaborate using these methods. So the banner says sustainable in the COVID-19 conditions, how does solidaristic food provision, by contrast, maintain or adapt Securitas Cortos with various resource-intensive, carbon-intensive activities extend previous means of agro-industrial methods, which heat up the planet. How do these activities reveal, mobilize, and strengthen collective capacities? La soberanía alimentaria, for food sovereignty, WTO, out of agriculture. And the crisis did create a great problem for, now more on the Latin American context, especially the concept economia solidaria. Here's just a headline has been characterized article along these lines. It means relationships of mutual aid, farmers' reciprocity, cooperation, other both within an enterprise and between enterprises, because and between despite the federal government and the president, state governments did what they should have done. Another key concept is circuitos cortos, or literally short circuits, hygiene, where they sometimes use the word, try to make sure that rather than food production chain, and especially farmers' markets, would not be transmitting the infection, have a broader meaning. That meant all sorts of equipment, more flexible meaning about solidarity, relationships, needs water, which was often absent in farmers' markets because they were in outdoor venues, better understand and support designed to have production methods on grounds that these are more environmentally sustainable, put into jeopardy the whole socially equitable system of direct sales to consumers, self-management of the enterprises and Securitas Cortos. And there were many ways to deal with this problem. In the case of Brazil, these movements have existed since at least an NGO, ONG, 90s. They were seen as central to Ecovida, shaping which a post-dictatorship society. AgriSol agroecology agenda for at least a decade before the pandemic. And here is its finally the major opportunity came with the election of just as manifest in one town, which I'll explain later, but it's a similar message all over the country. Although they didn't have a majority in parliament, and that became very difficult to face pass the distribute necessary legislation. But that's food to those who can't otherwise receive those years. And we asked everyone to help. Governments led by your donation can save lives. Dilma Rousseff, the government established a message being spread far beyond that network. Now here's another example of solidarity. The Cooperativa de Costureras Unidas Venceremos, you recognize that famous Spanish word, we will win, because it's a left-wing oriented cooperative, as they mainly are, which had been producing hands that had been building up garments from organic, which helped cotton, the Workers' Party, win that election. And they quickly produced, for a while there were several hundred face masks, perhaps separate movements to provide for hospitals and other public facilities that otherwise weren't receiving it. But eventually the state authorities especially saw that at least they would minimize the spread of the infection. In 2011 with that explicit purpose, coordinated by southern
these
city of Porto Alegre.
networks.
So that quickly sent out a message, exemplary action, which is taken forward up by the integration
groups all over the country.
Agroecology with Economia Solidaria.
And here's just, and hence we call it for short, Ecosol.
Part of the supply chain,
the short food
extra
supply
organic
chains take many forms.
Face masks was donated by Justitrama, which normally
Small-scale
sells.
producers
Consolidate their products for collective marketing.
Now we move on to the case study region.
Because otherwise they
Stathis
would be
Arapostathis.
totally marginalized by any significant buyer.
The name comes from the
And they
main
were
city
able
of
to do
Santos,
this more
which is
effectively
has been
through
a main port
a new
for this
program
century.
by the PT government called Programa de
Baixada de
Alimentos
lower,
so
it's the
acquisition of food acquisition program,
you can see it has
which
8 other
help train
small
towns
scale producers in the skills
and
of
that
cooperative
meant
organization.
there was
For
a
collective
difficulty
marketing and for gaining access to the
for
government policies, small-scale producers,
the next to which
peri-urban public
producers,
procurement, especially for
near
school
those
meals.
towns,
That's the meaning of alimentação.
had to deal with the
escolar,
new requirements,
which set favorable terms, a 30%
coordination
premium
of
price
those efforts and discussions
above the
carried out
conventional
by the
price
Forum
in
de
food
Economia
markets
Solidaria
for
Santista, which had
food
already
which
existed several years
was
before the
adequately
pandemic,
certified as organic
and some of the
or
same people
agroecological.
had been involved in
So
government
this
training
was a
programs,
crucial entry point for
and so
many
already had those
cooperatives
networks
of small-scale
in place.
producers. Of all the people who
And
had
then
been
that
trained
provided a
who
basis
benefited
for
from
them
training in those
to
previous years.
try to create or enter Feiras do Agricultor farmers markets,
For example, this is going back
where they
years,
then had the opportunity
first maker
to
of
make direct personal
small
relationships
basins,
with consumers who would come back every week.
Formations.
The one
Another
was
form,
sustainable food
here
production
is,
methods,
in Europe,
and then
is,
two,
community-supported
access to
agriculture,
markets,
whereby,
meaning
the consumers are really
capacities
subscribers
to access
to a weekly
solidarity
food basket,
market,
starting
which
with public
varies, of
procurement.
course, with the season.
The combination
And then
of
the
products
forum
that were successfully
supplemented
harvested and
those
so on.
official government programs
They
with
become,
specific courses
let's say,
such as
politically
non-conventional
educated
food
about
plants, the production methods,
food processing methods,
and the difficulties, perhaps,
by
in
contrast with
the
ultra processing of the
Now go back to our
agri-industrial
project.
system, where the light
It had
food processing
two
maintains the
main
nutrients,
questions
maintains the
originally.
taste,
How does
and can add some
ecosol
subtle
agroecology
tastes, such
develop
as
collective
spices,
capacities for
in
Secretos
ways that
Cortos?
remind
And what
people
methods can
of
help
their
to
favorite
identify,
childhood
strengthen, and
foods.
spread these
This is
capacities?
just one special feature of the farmers' markets, which then
Well, the
can
COVID-19
build
crisis,
personal
of course, pushed us to rethink
which we can call
or
it
to elaborate
sociocultural
those questions. So,
proximity with
in the
consumers.
COVID-19 conditions, how
They also
does solidaristic food
organize
provision
courses in community-based
maintain
tourism,
or adapt Secretos Cortos with
which
various advantages?
had an opportunity.
How do these
in
activities
the
extend
wonderful
previous
means
biodiverse
from
scenic
before the crisis,
territories
create new means?
near those
How do these
towns
activities reveal,
mobilize and strengthen collective capacities?
that biodiversity was being threatened by
And the
heavy
crisis
tourism
did
development,
create a
with
great
large
problem
condominiums built
for
close to the sea,
the
and by
Secretos Cortos, especially
second
the
homes
farmers markets.
for people who might
I mean, here's just
be living
a headline in a
Sao Paulo
newspaper article:
couple
the
hours
impact
away.
of the
So
epidemic
the community-based
on
tourism
the
was farmers
designed
markets
as an alternative,
and other forms of direct sales,
both a
to consumers,
positive alternative
and a way to resist
because
the dominant
the
model.
dis,
So these
despite
training
the federal
programs
government
generated
and the
women's
president's
cooperatives
state
and wider
governments
networks, such
did
as
what they should have done.
Yeah, the word for women. They
Impose
imposed
and specific
rules
groups,
of
which
hygiene
I'll mention
as we come to them.
to
Shortly after the
try to
pandemic
make
began,
sure there
that
arose
the whole
food production
a
chain,
new network,
and
Baixada
especially
Santista
farmers
de
markets,
Levidow,
would not
for
be
life,
transmitting
we will
the
win
infection
against the pandemic.
So that meant all sorts
They
of equipment,
organized
such as
food
sterilization, which needs water,
supplies to people
which
who
was
could
often
not otherwise
absent in farmers markets because they were in outdoor venues
buy it
which
or receive it,
weren't
for the
designed to
reasons
have
I
a
mentioned, because they might
water supply.
be self-isolating.
So this
especially
put into
vulnerable
jeopardy
to
the whole
pandemic
system
or
of direct
disabled or
sales to
whatever.
consumers.
So here you see two of the hundreds of volunteers.
And there were many ways to deal with this problem,
which were supplying this food.
Now here's
they held an anniversary
ONG
in
August, by which point they were regularly helping 9,000,
which had been promoting
receive these food supplies,
agroecology agenda for at least
the region
a decade before the pandemic.
And here is its.
I'll just mention at that
celebration, which has a 90-minute film version on the internet.
It was fascinating,
manifest in one town, which I'll explain later.
People who were involved as volunteers
all over the country
speak about their experiences, because previously
many of them lived in
distribute low-income neighborhoods or came from
to those who can't otherwise receive it, that is descendants of escaped slaves,
to help.
So your donation
can
save lives.
How they
had experienced
regular
insults for living in favelas
of solidarity.
The this program gave them a sense of collective pride in who they were and how they were contributing to left-wing oriented cooperative, as they mainly are, which had been producing 3 towns in turn,
garments,
to give more specific examples.
Cotton.
Now, every town had something like
and they
quickly solidarity network.
In this case,
face masks to provide to hospitals and other public facilities that otherwise weren't receiving it from the state authorities,
constructing
so that at least they would minimize the spread of the infection. And of course, this predates the pandemic by several years.
And that's
and then the new reality took on
an emergency
meaning.
So that
the pandemic
quickly sent out a
message.
Photos are from
both
these taken up by
many other
groups all over the country.
Had the opportunity to do a pilot study with
and here's
colleagues at UNESCO.
So
on the left part of the supply chain,
there's the
poster
the
Extra Organic Women's Union
for the
face masks was donated by
Just
a Trauma, which
promotes
normally sells a wide range of solidarity economy activities.
By
Stathis Agri-food.
The name comes from the
main city of
Santos,
burdens
has
of
been
women,
port,
including housework century, as well as their efforts to try to just gain their own lower independent livelihoods.
So
south of Santos,
and then on
the right,
one of the
pioneers, small towns,
in this
open air market, which had just begun shortly before we had our visit. There was in spring difficulty. So for those
the small-scale
producers, peri-urban rural producers near those towns, how to deal with the new requirements. And the coordination of those efforts and discussions was carried out by the Forum de Economia Solidaria and the Embaixada Santista, which had already existed several years before the pandemic. The main town, which I mentioned before, some of the same people had been involved in the government training programs. This network already had those networks, likewise had existed for about a year before. The people who had been trained or benefited from the training in those previous years. Rede de Productos do Bem. Now here, BEM evokes the concept Bem Viver. It was first literally translated as small basin to the geological formations. The one was sustainable food production methods, and then 2, access to markets, meaning the collective capacity of life, or cosmovision as they call it, solidarity market, starting life that respects fellow humans and nature. And then the forum supplemented those national concept programs. There has become specific courses such as non-conventional food plants, agroecology, light food processing methods. By contrast with beyond simply processing indigenous agri-industrial system, where the light food processing maintains the nutrients, maintain the taste, spread those values. It can add some subtle tastes, such as spices, relationships, in ways that remind people of their favorite childhood foods. Runs in parallel with one special feature of the farmers' markets, the warning sign about how to take all the necessary personal relationships, so that the fair, which we can call a socio-cultural tour, can continue in a safe way. Consumers, so keep a separation between the stalls, courses in community-based people, use the disinfectant, had an opportunity in the wonderful biodiverse scenic and territories. Stay at home if you have near those towns, but the flu. And if you're over 60 years old, biodiversity was being threatened by our new system will help deliver large condominiums, whatever you need to your sea, so you needn't go out and endanger yourself or others. Second homes for people who might. I mean, the full name is Solidaristics Consumidores Conscientes, conscientious consumers. So the community-based tourism was designed as an alternative. They are supporting both food, positive alternatives, and a way to resist the dominant model. Our environmental training programs generated women's cooperatives and wider networks. During the pandemic, then they had a much greater task to try to develop intermediaries. Shortly on a solidaristic basis, there arose a new network. Previously, the term intermediary was seen as a negative term. They organized profit-oriented intermediaries, such as a wholesaler or supermarket, to people who could not otherwise. But eventually, they realized they needed to appropriate this term to describe all the volunteers that were helping self-isolating, increase the food baskets, their delivery, pandemic, in some cases, and eco-bikers collective or cooperative, which had already existed, hundreds of volunteers, many other things, but then expanded dramatically. And I think they held an anniversary to increase the delivery of food August baskets, by which point they were regularly helping 9,000 the term people receive atravessadores, middlemen, as the negative term throughout the region, for what they don't want, and then appropriated the term. I'll just mention that at that celebration, which has a 90-minute film version on the internet, it was fascinating to hear the people who were involved as volunteers. Itanayam is the third town speak about their experiences, because previously farmers market, many of them lived in low-income neighborhoods, symbolic representation of Quilombo backgrounds, that is the descendants of escaped vision of society, teaching women. And they spoke about whose production methods respect had experienced regular insults. And on the right, obviously, during the pandemic, living in favelas, on the phrase. And this program, face masks, gave them a sense of made from collective pride in who they were and how they were contributing to people's welfare. Humorously, but in fact they did. Now I move in every three farmers market, and even more to give more specific examples. Solidarity networks. Now, every town had something like from the municipality, solidarity made sure that in this case people had the simple ruby face masks. The network has the slogan selling them very cheaply or even giving them away, constructing a new reality, meaning so that people would be safe. Of course, this predates the pandemic by several years. And then the new reality took on an emergency meaning during the pandemic. This is just one example on their Facebook pages. Which is when I had the opportunity to do a pilot study with my colleagues at they would have many pictures along the lines the left showed you, and in some cases a film poster showing how women's union, the face masks are used, promotes all across the food chain, a wide range of solidarity economy activities, beyond simply agri-food. And you can see the poster emphasizes the multiple burdens of women, including housework, as well as their efforts to gain their own all these precautions to keep people and the food safe from the coronavirus. And then on the right, one of the pioneers in this open-air market, which had just begun shortly before we had our visit in spring 2019. So productos, now we go back, So that's just one of many films that were put
around
onto the
rural
Facebook
producers.
pages, showing the systematic use of the face masks and often disinfectants across the whole food chain, starting from the production to the farmer's market itself. And again, these slogans, which were omnipresent: prevention is everything.
The main town, which I mentioned before,
everything is calm
had
because we are taking these precautions.
The
now further
network,
to this
which
third
likewise
town,
had existed for
I'll go
about
back
a year
in history
before
a few years. The municipality,
Rede de
in
Produtos do
cooperation with
BEM,
the Solidarity
here BEM evokes the concept Bem Viver,
literally, but with a quite
which
different
literally
meaning
translated
than it has
as being good
in
living,
Britain
but
or
that's not
some
really
other
what it
countries,
means.
where it's seen basically as charity.
It's a rough translation
Here,
of
one
an
key aim
indigenous Andean
initially
term,
was to
expressing
receive
really a different
shipments
vision of life, or
consignments
cosmovision, as they call it,
food from the
life that
indigenous
respects fellow
minority
humans and
community
nature.
for distribution under that school meals program that I mentioned
And
before.
that concept
so
being
just a
Viver
headline
has
from the
become
local newspaper.
central to
NKUA presents projects for the inclusion of the
agenda throughout
that
Latin
is
America.
the traditional maize,
beyond simply its
corn
original indigenous
of the
meaning,
into the school
it
menu.
expresses the effort to spread those
for
values throughout
security.
economic
that has special
relationships.
significance because that
And then
maize that goes back
that runs in parallel
has
with
a religious significance. So it became a source of pride to the
warning
community
sign
that
about how to take all the necessary precautions so that the fair
in the schools attended by their children. And another
can
initiative
continue in a safe way. So people separation between the stalls,
procure
between people,
fish from the
use the
fishermen
disinfectant
for this somewhat new technology,
food safe,
to separate
and stay at home if you have any
bones,
symptoms,
etc.
of the flu.
So that it could be a substitute
60
for
years
meat
old, stay at home,
in the cuisine
in
the school
system
kitchens.
will
much
help
more
deliver
helpful for the children,
whatever you need
fish
to your
and
home, so you need to go out and endanger yourself or others.
Regular good income for the Guarnari.
I mean, the full name is Solidaristic Consumidores Conscientes,
cooperatives
conscientious
to learn how to deal with the entire process,
meaning
that beyond the fishing as
they
such,
are
how to deal
supporting
with the whole process
food
inside the
systems,
the units that were processing the fish and
are environmentally sustainable and socially equitable. And during the pandemic,
and then further to the Banco de
then they had a much greater task to try to develop intermediaries on a solidaristic basis. And at first, this created some confusion because
some of them created a drive-through.
Previously, the term intermediary was seen as a negative term, meaning a profit-oriented intermediary, such as a wholesaler or a supermarket.
Created a drive-through for people to bring donations.
They realized they needed to appropriate this term to describe all the volunteers that were helping to increase the food baskets, their delivery. And in Santos, an eco-bikers collective or cooperative, which had already existed in delivering
going back to
many other things, but then expanded dramatically
ecology agenda has
during the pandemic to increase the delivery of food baskets. So they then substituted the
production methods,
the term atravessadores, middlemen, as the negative term.
These agendas demanded and gained support measures from
appropriated
federal
the term
agencies,
intermediarios,
especially collective capacity building and knowledge exchange processes. The training was carried out by regional or municipal authorities.
The third town that I mentioned. Again, has a
means to bring together all the relevant actors.
On the left,
and created multi-actor networks,
a symbolic representation
and then eventually
made possible its vision of society,
in this region.
Women whose production methods respect nature and biodiversity.
Since the pandemic
on the
began in March, they regularly held
visual
roundtable discussions
on the phrase organic face masks. Like
they brought together
made from organic
all these
cotton
actors to describe their responses to the pandemic,
humorously,
to exchange that knowledge.
In fact, they did
how
in every
more effective
farmers
ways,
market, and even more
how the
widely,
examples,
the solidarity
the best
networks,
examples,
often with assistance from the municipality, made sure that people had
series of
face masks,
tables, plus
either
the
selling them
Facebook
very cheaply or even giving them away,
are the main sources of information.
So that people would be safe and feel safe.
Now, these processes have facilitated
click on this.
whether that will work. Closer to consumers.
This is just one example on their Facebook pages.
These have been conceptualized by some of those prime movers.
They would have many pictures along the lines I showed you, and in some cases a film
quality food
showing
in multiple senses of the word quality.
Face masks
come from artisanal production methods
all across the food chain,
agroecological methods using local biodiverse resources, lightly processed methods, which maintains the nutrients and tastes, and culturally specific food traditions.
Taking all these precautions to keep people and the food safe.
These qualities are communicated to consumers by producers and by various intermediaries, such as the solidaristic networks in each town. In parallel, an organizational proximity involves mutual aid relationships within stakeholder groups.
So that's just one of many films
that were put onto the Facebook pages, showing the systematic use, as well as among them, often disinfectants, across the whole food chain, starting from the production types of farmers involved itself, cooperating. And again, these slogans, and all that's prevention is everything before the pandemic, but then in the field, everything potentially jeopardized public credibility of the secretive partners, especially for the safety of I'll go back in history a few solutions depended on many creative adjustments. The municipality solidarity cooperation with the solidarity to comply with the hygiene requirements, or else to devise alternative delivery methods, but with a quite different meaning than it has in people's homes, as a basis to warrant and maintain consumer trust, basically as charity. Another part of the story here, that one key some producers began to swap surplus products was to receive consumers' food diversity or product quality and producers' food from sometimes through collective marketing of those new combinations under that from the school meals program that I mentioned before. So despite obstacles from the local newspaper, solidarity networks have been expanding with the inclusion of the popularizing these as the traditional in raising their public profile. Corn. This agroecological expansion depends on integrating diverse expertise, developing collective capacities for democratic self-management, attracting more that has special significance, involving new solidaristic intermediaries, such as Levidow, gaining on religious significance. Support measures so it became a source of pride, including to the Guanari community, and inspiring similar practices at more sites, which did begin to happen, attended by their children through reform discussions. And another initiative from in these ways, the agroecology networks have contested the techno-diffusion agri-modernisation model, Guanari fishermen, counterposing a different for this somewhat new technology to separate the flesh from the bones. If you want to know more, so that it could be a substitute for meat. Well, the website, I suppose I should put that into the chat comment in the school kitchens. Yes, much more healthful for the children to have fish than meat, and then gave a regularly good income for the Guanari fishermen. In fact, Guanari's formed cooperatives. It has one article to learn how to deal with the entire process. I'll read that. Beyond the fishing as such, how to deal with the whole process inside. Everything else is in Spanish. The units that were processing the fish and turning it into a product useful for the school meals. Open up to questions or comments. To the Banco de Alimentos.
Thank you so much, Les. for such an
like
inspiring talk.
the
And
farmers markets in many other
I have
towns.
many questions.
They, well, some of them created a drive-through for people to buy the
how we
food
can
from their car
organize
window,
people, they can
just using
either
a credit card, of
activate
course.
their
In this
cameras
case,
and
the
address
Banco
the
de
question to
Alimentos
Les,
created a
or they
drive-through
can
for
just
people to
send
bring donations.
via the chat, and I
Just the
can
opposite.
deliver it
Deposit
to
those
Les, and Les
donations
can
at the
respond.
food bank. And that could be hygiene equipment
That was
and or food.
really inspiring, Les.
So now,
In order to
conclusion.
give some time to the audience to
So going
consume
back
what
to before the
you
pandemic,
presented,
the
I would like to,
agroecology agenda has
let's
expanded
say,
over the past
address
more
two questions,
as a result of
one general
conversions
and one
between
more specific. The general
prior
is
agendas for
whether
more
you
efficient production
see
methods
any kind
and
or
solidaristic
any,
economic
let's
activities.
say,
These
distinct
agendas
difference between
demanded and
solidarity
gained support
networks in
measures from federal
Brazil
agencies,
and those that
especially collective capacity
emerged
building and knowledge exchange
or developed it
processes.
in the
So
UK.
the
What
training was
would
carried
be
out by
would you
regional or
point out
municipal
as the
authorities,
main
which had the
commonalities and also
means to bring together all the
differences?
relevant actors and created multi-actor
And the
networks.
second question related
And then eventually
particularly to
made possible
something
the
that
forum, the
we
economy of
in CONEF
solidarity
we
in
are
this region.
interested about
And
modes of
I'll just
production
mention
and knowledge there.
Since the pandemic began in
Whether
March, they regularly held
COVID-19, whether
roundtable
the pandemic
discussions called
actually
Rodas de Conversas,
put
in
any
which they
place
brought
any
together
pressure,
all
radical
these
pressure
actors to
in
describe
relation to timing
their responses to the
the
pandemic,
production
to
in
exchange
those
that
small
knowledge, to
networks
discuss
of
how to
producers,
respond in
of
more
food
effective
producers.
ways, how the
What
examples,
altered
the best
them
examples in each case, could
in
be transferred to
doing
other places.
differently things or in
Like
producing
that
knowledge necessary in
series
doing
of
differently things
roundtables,
in those
plus
very
the Facebook
urgent
pages,
periods?
are the main sources of information. Okay, so I'll start with the first now, these processes, my knowledge of anything analogous in Europe or the UK, their greater proximity depends on collective from reading articles about them. These have been conceptualized by some of those from a European project in the forum, where I was doing sociocultural proximity involves study or food in multiple senses of the word quality. That's all we could manage. They come from artisanal production methods with Katerina, agroecological methods, using one of these seminars. That was a decade ago.
And also is in the advisory board of the project, Katerina.
Right. Which maintains the nutrients. And then more recently, a very small project and culturally specific did a similar study of non-conventional alternative food networks in London. Qualities are communicated to consumers by producers and by various intermediaries, active than anywhere else in the country for many reasons in each town. In parallel, an organizational I had the impression involves mutual aid relationships in Britain, stakeholder groups, that in many cases these started from organically certified initiatives, and as well as among which were trying to find municipal larger markets. So there are at least 3 or 4 types or trying to provide livelihoods, better livelihoods throughout the chain. And all that's before the especially in the production itself, but to gain crisis, potentially better jeopardize to avoid the intermediaries of the supermarket chains, the secretos cortos, especially for the safety of by direct developing solutions depended on many producers adjustments, along with the municipality. Although in some help with adders to comply cities in Europe, there is a similar public procurement systems favoring organic products, people's homes, that as a basis to warrant and maintain consumer trust.
because
another part of the story,
local authorities have the impression that it would be
began to
difficult
swap
to justify
surplus products.
even though it isn't
This
difficult to
arrangement
justify.
improved consumers through
The
diversity.
neoliberal
Product
agenda had a
quality and producers'
deterrent
income.
effect. So one of our case
Sometimes
studies
through
was in
collective
such an
marketing
area where
of
the
those new
local authority did
combinations
favor
from the different
organic
producers.
products. So despite obstacles
But in
from
any
the
case,
pandemic, solidarity
that's
networks have
how
been
I see
expanding
the
the
general
impetus
popularizing these
for
as an
something
economy of
analogous
proximity
in
raising their
Europe,
public profile.
that it starts from
This
the
agroecological
organic
expansion
sector
depends on
and then
integrating diverse
potentially
expertise,
benefits other
developing
producers
collective
who are
capacities for
basically
democratic
agroecological
self-management,
but not
attracting more
certified as
participants,
organic for various
involving new
reasons,
solidaristic
and charge lower
intermediaries,
prices than
such as
organic,
livres, gaining or
they
maintaining
have lower
support
costs,
measures from
and
state
that makes the food
authorities,
more
including
accessible. So a
municipalities,
wider
and
range of
inspiring similar
production
practices
systems
at
then
more sites,
benefits
which did
from those
begin to
short
happen,
food
especially
chains.
through reform discussions. So in
Within
these ways,
those
the
networks, of course, there are
eco-agroecology
many
networks
key
have
people
contested the
who
techno-diffusionist
envisage a
agri-modernisation
transformation
model, while
of the
counterposing
agri-industrial
a
food
different
system
norm.
through these alternatives. But that's
And if you want
really
to know more,
difficult to
here's
envision how that would happen
well, the website. I suppose I should put
simply
that
on the
into
basis
chat
of the
column.
alternative.
Yes,
Unless it is accompanied by a movement against what we don't want, because that has great support from various state support
it
measures.
has one article in English,
And an inherent market advantage for
ago.
procurement, say from local authorities,
But everything else is
which
in
want to deal with
Spanish,
just one big supplier.
Portuguese.
And that's often the reason given.
So
without
open up to
a clear shift
comments.
in state support measures,
so much, Les,
then
for such an
and
inspiring
without
talk.
a shift in land use,
I have many
particularly in
questions.
areas where the land itself has become too expensive for people to initiate
how we can organize
agricultural
people,
activities,
they can
then
either
it's difficult to
activate
see
their
how those
cameras and
alternatives
address the question
could
to
go
Les,
beyond
or they
simply,
can just
an
send
exemplary role.
via the chat, and I
And
can
so
deliver
the
it
people who
to
are promoting
Les,
like
and Les can
food
respond.
sovereignty,
I
mean,
that was
our right to do so,
really
right to spread those
inspiring to
ideas.
In
But
order
there's
to
a
give some
tension
time
between that agenda
to the audience
and the
to
practical
consume what
difficulties
you
of
presented,
doing more
I would
than
like
creating an
to,
alternative.
let's say, address
I'm sure there
two
are exceptions
questions,
to that
one
in
general
Europe,
and one
depending
more
on the
specific.
particular
The
place.
general is
But
whether
in
you
Brazil,
see
these
any
networks
kind or
did not
any,
come from the organic
let's
sector.
say,
And likewise throughout Latin
distinct
America.
difference between solidarity
Because
networks in
there,
Brazil
organic
and
has always been
those
seen
that
as an elite market
emerged
niche by
or
virtue
developed
of
in the UK.
being much more expensive
What would
than
be,
conventional food,
would you
by virtue
point
of
out as the main
needing a special
commonalities and
administrative
also
procedures for certification,
differences?
with third-party
And the
professional
second question
organizations which are paid
related,
to provide
particularly to
critical
something
certification, which is
that
then
we in
required
CONEF, we are interested
by
about modes of production
the state authorities who might be
and
procuring the
knowledge
food.
there.
So for all those
Whether
reasons, we're seen
COVID-19, whether
as,
the pandemic actually
well, environmentally better, but
put any
inherently
place
limited in
any
its
pressure,
both
radical
environmental
pressure,
and social benefits.
in relation
So
to
by contrast with that
timing the
elite market
production
niche, the
in
initiative, the
those
impetus
small
for this
networks of
EcoSol
producers,
agroecology
of food
initiative
producers.
came from lower income
What
people
altered
who were
them
trying to earn
in
livelihoods in more
doing
dignified cooperative
differently
means
things
than
or
simply
introducing knowledge necessary
selling
in
their
doing
labor
differently
power in a
things
competitive labor
in
market and
those
then
very urgent
selling their
period.
products in conventional markets. And I mean, for the EcoSol
Okay,
side,
so
it began
start with the first
enterprises.
one.
Perhaps
my knowledge of anything analogous
we covered
in Europe
factories that
or the
otherwise
UK
would have gone out of business,
initially
were taken
came,
over by the workers.
well, from reading
Hence the
articles,
key term enterprise in the beginning.
then eventually from
this
a
EcoSol
European
idea,
project
based on cooperation within and among enterprises across the whole chain, as we saw in the case of Justitrama supplying organic cotton to
that's all we could manage.
Univens,
With Catarina,
high-profile case for a long time in Brazil.
For one of these seminars, that was a decade ago.
By these means, people develop their collective capacities, and then work becomes truly dignified.
And then more recently, a very small
democratic
project
decision-making,
where I did a similar study of the
and then
alternative food networks.
The Eco-Sol agenda was then incorporated by or extended to agroecological production, and likewise as a means for those small-scale producers to bypass conventional markets.
And I had the impression,
in that case, the term enterprise
in
perhaps is a
Britain
misnomer.
that in many cases these started from organically certified initiatives.
So
which were trying
it was
to
a counter-hegemonic movement on both the Eco-Sol side
or trying to
and
provide
the agroecology
better
side,
livelihoods throughout the
especially
chain.
when the agroecology agenda was
especially
extended
in the
from
production
something
itself,
in
but
the margins to
gain
the landless workers movement.
A better income to avoid the
Since
intermediaries
around,
of the supermarket chains.
2000 perhaps, whereas initially when they were taking
By
over
developing direct relationships
land
with
not
producers.
under cultivation,
And
as
although in some
to do so according to the Constitution,
cities in
often
Europe,
then
there is a similar
facing severe
public
physical
procurement
repression
system
or assassination. When
favoring
they
organic
did
products.
that initially,
That
they
is less the
just
case
imitated
in Britain.
the agri-industrial methods that they had known when they were super
because
exploited as
local
laborers
authorities
on
have the
plantations.
impression that it would be
But then they
difficult to
quickly
justify,
realized this was
even though it isn't
a
difficult
dead
to
end,
justify.
and they began to
The
take up
neoliberal
agroecological
agenda had a
methods. So that gave
deterrent
enormous
effect.
political
So
force.
one of our case studies was in such
to
an area where the
agroecology
local authorities
and did more
favor
firmly located it within
organic
the
products.
Eco-Sol movement. So
but in any case,
in both respects, and then the conversion
that's how I
into
see
what
the
we call an Eco-Sol
general
agroecology
impetus
agenda.
for something analogous.
It's an inherently counter-hegemonic project,
that it starts from
which is
the
driven
organic
by
sector, and then
low-income
potentially
people,
benefits
people
other
who
producers who are
would be
basically
super exploited
agroecological but
and
not
now
certified
they'll
as
find
organic
a
for
better
various
future
reasons,
through that
and charge
alternative.
lower
So
prices than organic.
Short-ish, they have lower costs,
Answer
and that makes the food more
to your
accessible.
question.
So a wider range of
And the second
production
one
systems then benefit from
question
those short food
was-
chains. Oh, you're muted. Within those networks, of course, there are many key people who envisage a transformation of the agri-industrial food system
the concepts and pressures
through these alternatives.
to urgency triggered them
But that's
change,
really difficult
to implement
to
changes in the
envision, how that would happen
themselves.
simply on the basis of the
since the
alternative.
pandemic
in particular, unless it is accompanied by a movement against what we don't want,
any kind of change in the mode
because that has great support from various state support measures. Well, the only an inherent market advantage changes might be
for procurement,
an expansion in this alternative. Which want to deal with just one big supplier, then
that's often the reason
changing what is done by agro-industrial systems. So without, which of course is a clear shift in state support measures, yet, it's not yet clear how to make that happen. Without a shift in land use, it's a matter of expanding the alternative in areas where the land itself has become in several ways, including more small-scale producers, agricultural activities, who otherwise would have no entry point. It's difficult to see how those alternatives could go beyond simply an exemplary role that pool their surplus the people who are promoting like food sovereignty, finding more outlets to consumers, are right to do so. Either the farmers spread those ideas or these alternative delivery methods between that agenda, including delivery to people's homes, difficulties then of doing more than creating an alternative. Found the means through WhatsApp. I'm sure there are exceptions to that. In Europe, depending on systems, particular place. Then,
but in Brazil, these networks did not
all
come from the
consumers
organic sector
anywhere
but,
in a
and
town
likewise
know
throughout Latin
the
America.
quick information for what
In
products are
there,
available
the
from
organic
whom or
has
or
always
food
been
baskets.
seen as an elite market niche.
So this turned
by
into
virtue
a
of
crucial means
being
to
much more
expand
expensive
the sales
than conventional food
of the
by virtue of
agri-ecological products.
and then public
Needing special
visibility, administrative
likewise,
procedures for
through Facebook
certification,
and WhatsApp.
the third
What
party
was
professional
perhaps
organizations which are paid
an obscure
provide
alternative
credible
then became more
certification, which
widely
is then
known
required by
as a solidarity
the
market
state
or
authorities
an
who might be
economy of
procuring
proximity.
the food.
So
As
for
well
all those
as,
reasons,
it was seen
an alternative
as
to the dominant system.
well,
And
environmentally
something
better,
I
but
left out
inherently limited in its
both
that
environmental and social benefits.
in the run-up to
So by
the
contrast
local
with
elections
that
being
elite
held
market
throughout
niche,
Brazil
the initiative,
this month,
the impetus
the
for this
forum in the
Ecosol
Santista
Agroecology initiative
started
came from
last July
lower income people
to
who were trying to
promote
earn
its
livelihoods
manifesto
in more dignified
of
cooperative
40
means
support
than
measures
simply
that should be provided
selling
by
their
the state
labor power in
authorities.
a competitive labor market,
And it
then
asks all
selling their
election
products in
candidates
conventional
in the
municipalities
markets
to
and,
support.
for the
that
Ecosol side,
manifesto.
it
And then
began
organized a
with
series of webinars,
enterprises,
inviting
perhaps,
candidates
fábricas
to
recuperadas,
respond,
recover
to
those demands.
factories that otherwise would have gone
And of
out
course,
of business.
many of the candidates from the left-wing parties already supported the
key
demands,
term
or some of
enterprise
them
in the beginning
came to understand
idea,
better this agenda,
based on cooperation within and among enterprises across the whole chain, as we saw in the case of Justitrama supplying organic content to
just using the opportunity to get
Univens.
public exposure.
That's been a high-profile
Substantially
case for a long
engaging
time in
Brazil,
Brazil.
but regardless of the specific response,
By
the
these
fact
means,
of the manifesto,
people
its
develop their
reportage
capacities
in
and
the
then
regional
work becomes
newspaper or
truly dignified
newspapers, the
through
webinars,
the
all
democratic
these
decision
activities
making
gave much greater public exposure to the
and then
this alternative.
The Ecosol agenda was then
put
incorporated
in politics,
extended to
not just
agri-ecological production
solidarity market.
and likewise as a means for those
And there were many
small-scale
more
producers
participants, like
to bypass conventional
or
markets.
libres. But of course,
in
started with a
that
small
case, the
number
term
of people
enterprise perhaps is a
year.
misnomer.
And
So they
by now,
often use the term
they say they've got at least 1,000 people who are regularly participating.
It was a counter-hegemonic movement,
cooperatives
on both the Ecosol side
and
the agri-ecology
solidarity,
or volunteer
especially when the
deliverers
agri-ecology agenda
as consumers
was extended from something in the margins to the
those are just
workers'
some
movement.
Indicators of how the alternative
Since
is
around
expanding and has potential for greater
2000
expansion.
perhaps, whereas
How
initially when they
that
were taking
then
over
could turn into
land not under
a
cultivation,
significant change in the dominant
Yes,
system. Well,
they're
that's the big
entitled
question.
to do so according to the
Needs
Constitution, though often
clear
then
strategy and
facing
and that
severe
means
physical repression or assassination. When they
weakening the
did
state
that
support
initially,
for the dominant system.
they just imitated the agri-industrial methods that
So
they had
stop
known
there
when they
so
were
we can have
super
more
exploited
questions.
as laborers on plantations.
We have
But
all
then they quickly
questions.
realized
One
this was
question by
a
Nick
dead
to
end,
you. This who is
and
a
they began to take up
politician, but
agroecological methods. So that
is
gave enormous
supervised by
political
me,
force
and Nikos is doing
to
field work in
agroecology and more firmly located it within the Ecosol
biochemical
movement.
labs
So
here in
in
Greece.
both respects, and then their convergence into
His
what
question
we call
is
an Ecosol
this.
agroecology agenda.
What I find, and I quote now,
It's an
what
inherently
I found
counter-hegemonic
very
project,
interesting in this
which is
is
driven
that
by
the arguments of
low-income
the
people,
initiatives of
people who were
Ecosol
or would be super
did not
exploited,
change in
and
the
they'll
state
find a better
of the
future
pandemic.
through
Instead,
that alternative. So that
the initiatives, they were
short-ish
enhanced.
answer
In this
to your
perspective,
question.
normality
And
seems
the
to
second
be the problem,
second
making
question
the debate mostly
was,
political.
oh, you're muted.
Let's say the debate is between local and locality against big corporation Is this the right framing of this debate? Do you agree on that? Pressures in relation to urgency.
Well, certainly it was made political in several senses of the word political.
To implement changes in the mode of production.
Agri-food systems
You mean since
more
the
readily
pandemic
framed
in
as
particular?
critical.
Yes, in particular.
No, as the dominant system as pathogenic
Can you identify
and environmentally harmful on the one hand, by contrast with
built there?
agroecological methods on the other hand as environmentally beneficial.
Well, the only
and more socially equitable
changes might be,
in that sense,
an expansion in this alternative. That's quite different than changing what is done by agro-industrial systems.
State support measures,
which of course is a key objective,
essential for the maintenance and especially the expansion.
It's not yet clear how to make that happen.
Alternative.
At this stage,
as in
it's a matter of expanding
the national manifesto
in several ways, including more small-scale producers,
like the national,
who otherwise would have no entry point.
Court articulation, as it's
gaining
called,
an entry point through more and more cooperatives that do collective marketing, that pool their surplus products, etc.
And that it
finding
involves
more
people's
outlets to
everyday
consumers
activities
through either the farmers markets or these
an
alternative
opportunity
delivery
to
methods,
engage,
including delivery to people's homes,
mutual aid activities,
then
and change your relationships.
Found the means through WhatsApp,
and in
WhatsApp
that
systems.
Respect, but maybe
gave
a better way to put it would be
it's
not simply about local versus
anywhere in a town,
national or
quick
small
information.
It's
for
about
what products are available
opposing
from whom or food baskets.
The colonization of the local.
So this turned into a crucial means to expand the sales
system
of the agroecological products,
which in
and then public visibility,
benefits
likewise through Facebook and WhatsApp,
sell the technology packages.
What was perhaps
so it's counterposing a system based
an
on
obscure alternative, then became more
knowledge
widely known as a solidarity market or an economy of proximity,
which I mentioned.
As well as
political in multiple senses,
an alternative to the dominant system.
Just to follow up on this,
and something I left out
in Brazil. You can say that the incumbent
in the run-up to the local elections being held throughout Brazil this month, the forum,
or
Santista,
much more complicated.
Started last July to promote its manifesto.
But it is dominated by corporations.
Support measures,
how many I'm not sure,
that
because
should be provided
you would need to look at
by the state
who
authority.
supplies the technology packages
and it
and
asks
various
all
components.
election candidates,
in some cases,
in the
it is the same
municipalities
company
to support
perhaps originally
manifesto,
hybrid seeds
and then organized a series of webinars inviting
when
the candidates
comes to the
to
herbicide
respond
tolerant
to those
GM
demands.
Which
And of course,
agriculture.
many of the candidates from the left-wing parties already supported the demands,
then
or
it
some
is
of
the
them
same company because
came
the
to understand better
integrated
this
by
agenda
that
through the
into the
demands,
design
and took up the demands.
of the herbicide
Candidates from
tolerant
other parties,
seeds.
perhaps,
And then when it comes to the marketing,
just using the opportunity to get
State,
public exposure. Most food supplied to supermarkets or even small shops, regardless of the specific response,
goes through
the fact of
for
the manifesto,
large wholesalers.
its reportage in effect, the regional newspaper or town newspapers, the
which
webinars,
suppliers
all of these
are able to enter
activities
those
gave much greater public exposure.
And of course, they take a large
to
cut themselves.
This alternative,
so that
of course, in politics,
those suppliers may
include some organic ones,
solidarity market,
but then it just becomes. And there were many more participants,
as I mentioned before.
Olivres, started with a small number of people, perhaps last year.
Okay. Thank you very much. One more question by
now, they say they've got at least 1,000 people who are regularly participating
and is
as
conducting
producers
an
cooperatives
STS study on the agri-food
solidarity
networks in
or
Greece with
volunteer
an emphasis
deliverers
on meat.
as consumers placing orders and so on.
Alexandros, do you want to activate
So those are just some
your camera and
indicators
address the
of how
question
the
to Les? Or
alternative is expanding and has
okay.
potential
Sure,
for
sure,
greater
exactly.
expansion.
Hello, Dr. Levidow.
And
Thank you
how
for being
that
here.
then could
Thank you
turn
for
into
the very interesting
a
presentation. My
significant
question to
change in
you
the
would be,
dominant system. Well,
and
that's
please,
the big question.
if I'm
Which,
mistaken,
needs
correct
a
me.
clear
It
strategy,
goes as
and that
like
means
this. So you mentioned the initiatives of
weakening the state
agroecology
support for the dominant
that were
system.
developed by lower income people as a means to use their labor and find
So I'll
markets
stop
for
there
their
so we can have
products.
more questions.
These initiatives, if I gather
Very good
correctly, seem
questions.
to provide
One
some
question by
alternatives
Nick,
and
will
possible
use
pathways
this
which
with a
are
PhD
compatible
student
in a
that
way with policies
is
of
supervised
lockdowns
by me,
and
and
possible
Nikos is
isolation
doing
of areas.
fieldwork
So
in
my question is twofold. Is
biochemical
crisis like the present
labs
pandemic an
here in
opportunity for
Greece.
them to transcend from a
His
maturing
question
niche
is
to
this.
being part of the regime,
What I
bringing
find, and I
solidarity
quote
economy
now,
to the
what I
mainstream and
found
lead to a new
very
pathway and
interesting in
changes
this
in the incumbent
is
regime?
that the
Or
arguments of
is it
the
a risk to strip
initiatives
an
of
ideologically
ECOSOL did
weighty
not
practice of
change
its
in
social
the
claims
state
and serve the
of the
already existing,
pandemic.
the
Instead,
present incumbent regime?
the
It's kind of
initiatives, they
both
were
political and
enhanced.
to the
In this
side of
perspective,
policy, the question.
normality
Thank you.
seems to be the problem, making the debate
But if I
mostly
understand the
political.
question
Let's say,
correctly,
is the debate is
I
between
think the
local and
problem
locality against
is
big
different than the
corporation?
risk
Is this
of
the
serving
right
the dominant
framing
regime.
of this debate?
Of course, any
Do you agree
alternative
on that? This is the question.
has the potential to be incorporated. Well, certainly, it was made political in several senses of the word political, and certainly agroecology, agri-food systems, or at least some techniques, more readily framed as political, incorporated as the dominant system as pathogenic to the dominant system in various ways, harmful on the one hand. That's would be a different talk about sustainable intensification. I published an article on that, which I can, and it's available equitable to anyone in that sense, political, but also that the state support. And that lends itself much more easily to the dominant system than, say, economy of solidarity, support measures. Those are actually existing social bonds for the maintenance and especially the expansion of this. Now, of course, people could collectively, in the cooperate, national manifest their own exploitation of national organization, producing and selling products for competitive capitalist markets, and sometimes that has happened, but that was one reason. And then by its local manifestations, economy and solidarity, has mutual aid, reciprocity among enterprises, and that it not just involves people's everyday activities. That's the person is political. So it's an opportunity to engage in the risk of incorporation, mutual aid activity, in that sense, if and change your relationships to your fellow citizens, fulfill and in that respect fundamental aims. A better way to put it would be it's economy. It's not simply about local versus more. How to small versus big continue, and especially how to expand opposing in a period when all the colonization of the local have been degraded or including even abolished its local food systems by the aggregators. The networks I described, the wholesalers in that one region, which in turn emerged benefits the well-funded and well-staffed sell the technology training programs over the previous decades. It's counterposing system based on solidarity network that had collective knowledge of biodiverse resource programs in recent years, and these various forms of proximity. I'm not sure whether that's typical or unusual in Brazil. So, but in any case, political in multiple senses. Now, without those
just to
training
follow up on
programs
this,
and solidarity networks
incumbent
already in
regime
place from
in
before the
Brazil,
pandemic,
you
then
can
it
say
becomes
that
more
the
difficult
incumbent
just to
agri-food regime
initiate
is
such an
dominated and
alternative
configured by big
during the pandemic.
corporations, or
So I
is
think
much
that's
more complicated,
a crucial
the
limitation
configuration of
now
the
with the
incumbent
government
regime?
that
is obviously
dominated by
hostile to all of this.
corporations. You know, how many, I'm not sure, because
then you would need to
after, well, who supplies the
judicial coup
technology
d'etat
packages
against
and its
President
various
Dilma
components?
Rousseff
In some cases, it is the same company.
her
Former
agriculture
originally
minister
with the hybrid seeds and the
newspaper
agrochemicals, they might be different
saying that
companies.
the new
But when it
government, then
comes
headed
to
by
the
Temer,
herbicide tolerant, wants
GM
to
seeds,
extinguish
which
peasant
dominate
agriculture
because
in
some
it's
parts
seen
of the
as an
country,
obstacle. Then
to
it is the same
progress
company, because the packages
integrated
to
by
the
that
expansion
of
into the
agribusiness
design
and industrial
of the
agriculture
herbicide
throughout the
tolerant
country.
seeds. And it is an obstacle. And then when it
from that
comes to
perverse
the marketing
neoliberal standpoint,
in Sao Paulo State,
so I think that's
most
the main
food
problem
supplied
now,
to
that
supermarkets or even small shops
for new initiatives and networks
goes through
that
4 large
want to do
wholesalers.
something like this.
So in
It's
effect,
much more difficult to access
control
the public support measures than
which
it was
suppliers are able to enter those
before
systems.
2016.
And of course, they take a large cut
But
themselves.
I think that's why our project
Of course,
emphasize
those suppliers may include some organic
capacities.
ones, but
What
then
are
it
these
just becomes
capacities? How
an
are they
affluent
developed?
market niche, as I mentioned
And
before.
through what support measures? So that people
So that's a
elsewhere
short answer.
can learn from that experience
Okay.
and
Thank you
find
very
some
much. One
means
more
to
question
develop
by
those collective capacities.
Alexandros Vakoulas. Alexandros is a member of CONEF and is conducting an STS study
Okay, I have one question by Mirto
agri-food
Galani,
networks in Greece with an
and I
emphasis
quote
on
here,
meat.
do you think
Alexandros, do you
that
want to activate
there exist opportunities
your camera and
regarding
address the
urban
question to Les,
agriculture
or
movements,
okay,
collective
yes.
Of course, yes,
land
okay.
claims,
Hello,
distribution
Dr. Levidow.
networks,
Thank you for being here.
in terms of
Thank you for
strengthening the
the
existing
very
rural
interesting
dynamics?
presentation. My question to you would be, and please, if I'm mistaken, correct me.
Well, maybe I'll speak first about
Like
peri-urban
this.
agriculture.
So you mentioned the initiatives of
Because that
agroecology
characterizes
that were developed by lower
the
income people
towns in
as a means to use
our
the
case
labor
study
and
region.
find markets for their
There-
products.
There's much
These
agricultural
initiatives,
activity
if I gather
near each
correctly,
of those
seem to
towns,
provide some alternatives and possible pathways
which either already existed or was
in a
incentivized
way
by
with
the
policies of
opportunities
lockdowns
of those government
and possible
programs
isolation
and
of
farmers'
areas.
markets.
So
And
my
with a
question is
relatively short
twofold.
physical
Is
distance,
crisis
then
like the
provided a
present
basis
pandemic an
for
opportunity for them
other
to
kinds of
transcend
proximity.
from a maturing niche to being part of the regime, bringing solidarity economy to the mainstream
I'm not
and lead to
aware
a new pathway and changes in the incumbent regime?
urban agriculture
Or
in those
is
cases.
it a
It may
risk to
exist to
strip
a
an
small extent,
ideologically
but
weighted practice of its social
perhaps
claims
in
and
many
serve the already
European
existing
cities, yeah, there
and
has
present
been
incumbent
a
regime?
revival of
It's kind of
urban agriculture.
both political and to the
And in
side of
fact, in some
policy of the
cities
question.
in Latin America as
Thank
well,
you.
and especially in Argentina. But if I understand the question of the agroecology movement, so that likewise is different than, or would be more visible, might more easily gain volunteers, because it's, of course, any alternative people live, has the potential to be. So insofar as land can be found, co-opted, and used for that purpose, then it becomes part of this alternative. And certainly agroecology. Perhaps I'll just mention in London. I mean, there have been some techniques, politically well-organized efforts to gain more land for agriculture into the dominant system in various ways. Within that's the city. Would be a different talk about sustainable intensification. And more importantly, to gain secure tenure to anyone online for using that land for agricultural purposes for at least a decade or two decades to the dominant system. By contrast, what then say economy of solidarity spaces, because those are actually existing social bonds. Uncertainty about the future use for more lucrative purposes. Now, of course, people could collectively given cooperate and self-manage their own exploitation. There's no secure basis for making significant investment in the space, producing and selling products for
So in places where the land has a high financial value, that has happened, but that was one reason. Then it's much more difficult economy of solidarity, gain long-term mutual secure access to reciprocity among enterprises. I mean, that's what we saw not just within, especially in New York City, about a decade or two ago, where there was a wonderful movement of community gardens, growing food, creating these solidaristic bonds, the risk of incorporation. And they fought in that sense. They resisted the initiatives, the attack by the financialization of fulfill, but they just could not prevail against fundamental aims. That may be an extreme case, but there's solidarity economy. So yes, insofar as it can be done, then how to continue, and especially how to expand in a period when all the state support measures have been degraded or even abolished.
We have one raised hand.
The networks I described
by Maria Zarifi,
in that one region emerged from
Maria,
well-funded and well-staffed training programs.
Well, thank you very
over the
much.
Decade.
It is really a very
thought-provoking
that had talk, and I'm interested in issues
years.
regarding environmental
I'm not sure whether
and
that's
climate
typical
change
or unusual in Brazil,
and the impact these changes have on public health.
Those
Therefore,
training programs,
I would like to ask you the following. As I understand you, if I understand you correctly,
then it becomes more
you
difficult
described
just to
4,
initiate
let's say, parameters
such an
that
alternative
could lead or that can describe the new normal: food sovereignty, peasant agriculture, territorial markets, and agroecology, if I understand you correctly.
Is obviously hostile
I
to
would
all of this.
like to
to put
pose
it more bluntly,
the question regarding the two of these, let's say, parameters, the food
judicial coup
sovereignty
d'etat
and the
against
agroecology.
President Dilma Rousseff in
I was
2016.
wondering if
Her former
this
agriculture minister gave an
is
interview in a
included
newspaper
the
saying that the
cultivation
new
of agricultural
government, then
products
headed by Temer,
that have lower
wants to extinguish
environmental
peasant
footprint.
agriculture because
I mean,
it's seen as an
it's not
obstacle
only food sovereignty
to
for the local
progress
and the topical, the territorial
to the
markets,
expansion
but
of agribusiness and industrial agriculture
are
throughout
they
the country.
interested in
And it is an
cultivating
obstacle from that
agricultural
perverse
products that do not
neoliberal
harm the
standpoint.
environment
So
much?
I think that's the main
Or
problem
this is not
now,
a part of the
is
scheme?
that it's for
Thank you.
new initiatives and networks. Yes, well, environmentally sustainable methods
to
do something like this have always been central. It's much more difficult to access the agroecology and organic agriculture. I mean, before 2016, those are closely related, but with variations. I think that's why our projects that organic agriculture sets minimum capacities for environmental. What are these capacities, methods? How were they developed? What it should through what support measures? It shouldn't use any chemical pesticides elsewhere. Except can learn from that experience and find some means that are to develop this collective capacity authorized. And organic agriculture has been perhaps a laboratory and a showcase for agroecological methods, which could be applied more widely.
And I quote here,
throughout agriculture, beyond
do you think
those
that
production
there exists
units which are
opportunities
officially
regarding
certified?
urban agricultural movements?
So this has always been
land claims,
the appeal
distribution networks,
of
in terms of
the alternative,
strengthening the existing
and
rural dynamics.
We call it knowledge intensive rather than input intensive. Well, maybe I'll speak first about knowledge of the biodiverse resources and how to recycle. That characterizes how to design the towns in what we call agro-ecosystems regions. Far beyond the cultivated area, agricultural activity that near each of those towns, biodiversity, and provide which either already existed or was incentivized by the opportunities of those government programs and the farmers markets, avoids attracting pests in the relatively short physical distance, then provided a basis. These are just some aspects of the knowledge which really has to be created collectively.
through networks.
I'm not
of
aware
farmers using these methods
of
and has
urban
depended also to some
agriculture in
extent
those
on,
cases.
it may exist to a small extent,
Agri-ecological scientists
trying to
perhaps
systematize
in
the
many
knowledge.
European
To
cities,
understand
there has
these
been
methods
a
may be more
revival
effective
of urban
in
agriculture,
some places rather than others.
and in fact in some cities in Latin America as well,
and especially in
So
Argentina.
I hope that answers your question about environmental
part
sustainability
of the
But
agroecology
then we come
movement,
to the but,
perhaps.
So that likewise would benefit,
would be
as far
more
as that
visible,
goes, it
might
could
more
just
easily
remain
gain
a marginal
volunteers,
niche,
because
either
it's near
inexpensive
to where people
market
live.
niche
For
So insofar as land can be
wealthy
found
people
and
buy
used for that
organic
purpose,
food,
then it
and
becomes
dependent
part of
on
this alternative.
supermarket chains.
But perhaps I'll just
which
mention in London, I mean, there have been
take a large part of the value added by the
critically
producers.
well-organized
So they
efforts, and
to
they may
gain more
even
land
be
for agriculture.
thrown into competition with lower cost production in the global south. I mean, that was a problem in this
boundaries
country,
of Greater London,
and
where the
more
supermarket
importantly,
chains
to gain
started
secure tenure
importing organic food
for
from Caribbean
using
islands
that land for
and
undercut
purposes
for at least a decade or 2 decades.
in this country.
By contrast, or it could remain marginal.
in the sense
Meanwhile,
of
people
spaces
just growing food for
but
themselves. Meanwhile,
or
there's some
sharing it with their
uncertainty about
neighbors,
the
the
future
friends,
use for
having
more
no way
lucrative
to earn a
purposes.
livelihood.
And then licenses
So
given.
that's
The gap
which is better
being
than
filled
nothing,
by
but the economy
there's
is
no
solidarity.
secure basis for
A
making
way
significant
to
investment in
create
the space. Alternative markets or solidarity markets. So in
which
places
don't
where the land has a high valorize, then monetarily
it's much more
difficult
to
sustainable
methods.
gain long-term secure access
that
to
sort
food
of
and
answer your
spaces.
question?
I mean, that's what we
Yes,
saw,
absolutely.
especially
But
in New York
if,
City.
if I have
A decade or
a
two
moment
ago,
to
there
add
was a
something
wonderful
on
movement
this,
of
Community gardens, growing
2
food,
days ago I was
creating
reading
solidaristic bonds, and
from
they
the
fought,
London
they
School of
resisted
Hygiene and Tropical Diseases,
the attack by the
not a
financialization of
report, but
land
kind of
that they
article
just could not
regarding that
prevail against
1/3
those
of the
forces.
fruits and
And
vegetables
that may be an
the
extreme
UK
case, but there's a
consumes
similar conflict
come
in many
from
cities. So yes,
climate
insofar
vulnerable
as it can be done,
countries.
then great.
And that
But perhaps
I think advocates
the
what you have said.
peri-urban
I
has
mean,
greater
how on the one
possibilities.
hand we can talk about sustainable,
Okay, thank you, Miss. We
let's
have
say,
one
solidarity
raised
network,
hand
and
by Maria
let's say support
Zarifi.
territorial
She's
and
studying
topical
obstetrics medicine. Please, Maria,
markets.
move on
And on the other
and
hand,
address your questions.
we send,
thank you very
let's say,
much.
a large amount
really
of our
very
production, organic production, to
talk, and I'm interested
countries,
in
issues
regarding
or
environmental and climate change.
I don't know if
and the impact
this
these
is helpful
changes
or
have
contradicts
on public
you
health.
said already.
Therefore,
This,
I would
let's
like
say,
to ask you the following. As I understand you, if I understand you correctly,
Well, those
you
examples relate
described
to the general
4,
concept of
let's
food
say,
sovereignty,
parameters that
which
could lead or that
needs
can describe the new normal. Food
urges
sovereignty,
a
decent
fundamental
agriculture,
change in
territorial markets, and
what food is produced,
agroecology,
where,
if I
how, for
understand you
what
correctly.
purposes, and where it's sent.
I would like
Is the
to
basic principle.
pose a
Each
question regarding the two of these, let's say,
geopolitical
parameters, the food
unit
sovereignty
or
and the
area
agroecology.
should try to produce,
I
should
was
be
wondering
enabled to produce
if
as much
in
as
this
possible
scheme
of the food
is
that it
included
wants to consume.
The cultivation of agricultural products that have
here I'll
lower
give an example
environmental
from
footprint.
Olivres in Santos.
I mean, it's not only food sovereignty
in
for
their
the local
engagement with
and the
consumers,
the
calling
territorial
themselves
markets,
conscientious
but
consumers, they try to do political education about the origin of
are
food.
they interested in cultivating
Most consumers have been accustomed to
agricultural
going to a
products
supermarket
that
and
do not
buying
harm the environment
whatever they like,
much?
anything produced from anywhere in Latin
Or this is
America
not
or even
a part of
further
the
away
scheme?
all year round.
Thank you.
Right? Because somewhere in the world, environmentally sustainable methods
in any given month
have always
so that's
been
enormously
wasteful
of environmental resources, organic agri-food is produced, of the shipping costs, and those are
undermines
closely
local
related
production
of something that would be seasonable and environmentally
organic agriculture
seasonal,
sets
and
minimum
environmentally
standards
sustainable.
for environmentally
So they're
sustainable
trying to use that opportunity
methods, especially
to change consumers'
what it
expectations.
shouldn't do.
It shouldn't use
what
any
counts as good food,
pesticides, except good food should be
seasonal,
good
productos de
chemicals
bien
that are in the multiple sense of the word.
authorized.
So that's just in microcosm, this global problem.
Organic agriculture
has been a
globalization,
a laboratory and a showcase for
diverse
agroecological methods, which could be
to
applied more
satisfy
widely
supposed consumer
to
demand.
agriculture. Well, where does that demand comes from? It's expectations created by wholesalers units which are officially certified. So as regards food,
So this has
coming
always
to,
been
say, more
the
affluent
appeal
countries from more climate
the
vulnerable
alternative.
areas. I mean, that's a problem for multiple
We call
reasons.
knowledge
It's
intensive,
undermining the local
intensive
provision of, because it needs
those places
knowledge of
supplying
the biodiverse
food
resources
recycling
and
areas,
how to
recycle
the land
the
use methods,
how to design
may be
what
undermining
we call
the soil fertility,
agro-ecosystems,
especially
far
if it's
beyond
using
the
cultivated
cultivated area.
packages
In a
even
way
fertilizers
that
maintain
undermine
biodiversity, provide, by contrast,
natural
with predators of any pests,
fertilizers from animal
do
waste,
multi-cropping in a way that,
and it's also
undermining avoids attracting
food
pests
quality
in the first place in the wealthy areas, importing the
So
food. These are just some aspects.
Britain
of
is
the
now producing
knowledge,
far less
which
of the
really has
food
to
that
be
we
created
eat
collectively
than it did
a half a century
through
ago.
networks of farmers
And
using
that's
these methods,
partly
and
result
has
of the
depended
common
also to
agricultural
some
policy
extent
on
increasing some kinds of production.
agri-ecological
Scientists
production for export,
are trying to
systematize the knowledge
and
to
reducing,
understand how these methods
especially
may be
food
more
production,
effective, and then
in
that
some
has intersected
places
with
rather than others.
a neoliberal agri-food policy, which has dominated, I hope, the
that,
governments
answers your
of this
question
country
about
environmental
for at
sustainability
least
for decades.
But then we come to the
with
but,
the idea,
perhaps,
well,
that
it doesn't matter what we produce because we can buy whatever we need from
as far as that
anywhere in the
goes, it
world.
could just remain
And it
a
won't be
marginal
very
niche,
expensive.
either
that has been the dominant
inexpensive
assumption
market niche
for until recently, at least. Well,
the people.
there are many
Social
social movements
food
and
dependent on
farmers groups trying to
supermarket
change
chains,
that assumption,
which
it's a take
now
a large part
it was
of
always an
by the
unjust,
environmentally harmful
environmental,
assumption,
and they
but
may
now it
even
becomes a
be
dangerous
thrown
assumption,
into
even
competition
a danger to us,
with
as well as a danger
lower
to
cost
the
production
places
in the global south.
I mean, that was a problem
that
in
are
this
exporting
country,
the food to us,
where the supermarket chains started importing
Okay, thank you
organic
so
food
much,
from Caribbean
Les.
islands,
Any other
and then
question?
undercut. And I put
organic
the article
producers in
about
this
London
country.
into the chat,
We
or it
got
could
you.
remain marginal in the sense of people just
Any
growing food
other
for themselves, but
question
having
or comment?
or
to Les?
sharing it with their neighbors and friends, but having no way to earn a livelihood from it.
Not
So
so
that's
far as I see.
the gap being filled
So,
by
and we don't want
the
to
economy
exhaust you,
solidarity,
Les. I have many
a way
questions
to
relevant,
create
particularly to your
alternative
very
markets or
final
solidarity
comments
markets,
that resonates
which
a lot with the aims and the scope
valorize
and what we are looking at the CONEF.
monetarily
But,
the
we
environmental
will continue the
sustainable
discussion
methods.
at
So does that
another
sort of
setting
answer
that
your question?
we are trying to
Yes,
set.
absolutely. If I have
I would like to thank you so
a
much,
moment to
Les.
add
That was
something
really inspiring,
2
very
days ago, I
thought-provoking
was reading
talk, and
from
we
the
brought into the
London
center
School
of
of
the
Hygiene
discussion
and
of
Tropical
the
Diseases,
local SPS community the issue of
not a report, but kind of
agroecology
article
and
regarding
alternative
that one-third of the
pathways.
fruits and
This
vegetables
is very important.
the
Thank you
UK
so much.
consumes
I know
come
that you
from
are very
climate
you are a
vulnerable
big friend of
countries.
Greece.
And
So next time,
this is a
I
promise.
think advocates what you
I
have
hope
said.
to have
I mean, how on the one hand we can
Levidow
talk
in
about
person in
sustainable,
the department, and also
let's say,
for a nice
solidarity
dinner.
network,
And according to my
and,
information,
let's
you
say,
know,
support
to
territorial
play
and topical
Rebecca, so we look
markets.
forward for
And on the other hand,
less. That's what my
we
informant
send,
said.
let's say, a large amount of our production, organic production, to countries, to Western countries, to
And
European
I
countries,
would
or
even
I don't
offer
know how you can
to
call it.
accompany
And
someone
I don't know
in
if
this event who
this,
can sing,
let's say, is helpful, or
but
it
the internet
contradicts.
has
But
a
you said
time
already
delay,
it's a gap in this, let's say,
which makes
network.
it impossible to have synchronous.
Yes, so
Well, those
music
examples
making
relate to
through
the
the
general
internet,
concept of
of
food
course, is a big
sovereignty
problem
for all music groups
which
that needs
wanted to
continue practicing.
urges
During
big
fundamental
pandemic.
change
So
will need to be in person.
what food is produced,
Yes,
Where,
indeed.
how,
that
for what
time
purposes,
And this
and
is
where
the
it's
promise.
sent.
Thank you so much once
is the
more.
basic
We will
principle
continue the
in
discussion. We will
each
keep you updated
geopolitical
about the progress of
unit
CONEF.
or
Thank you
area
so much for being
should
so
try to
supporting and for
produce,
giving this
should be
very
enabled
nice
to
and
produce
thought-provoking talk.
as
Thank you
much
so
as
much.
possible
Bye-bye,
of the
everybody.
food that it wants to
And
consume.
next talk is
Now,
in
wants,
December. Thank
well,
you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Here I give an example from Olivres in Santos. I mean, in their engagement with consumers, I mean, and in calling themselves conscientious consumers, they try to do political education about the origin of food. But most consumers have been accustomed to going to a supermarket and buying whatever they like, anything produced from anywhere in Latin America or even further away, all year round, right? Because somewhere in the world may be producing that product in any given month. So that's enormously wasteful of environmental resources where the food is produced, of the shipping costs, and undermines local production of something that would be seasonable and environmentally, or seasonal and environmentally sustainable. So they're trying to use that opportunity to change consumers' expectations of what counts as good food. Good food should be seasonal, good productos de bem in the multiple sense of the word. So that's just in microcosm, this global problem of, say, globalization of standard, but diverse products from all over the world to satisfy supposed consumer demand. Well, where does that demand comes from? It's expectations created by wholesalers and supermarket chains. So as regards food coming to, say, more affluent countries from more climate vulnerable areas, I mean, that's a problem for multiple reasons, that it's undermining the local provision of those places supplying the food to affluent areas. The land use methods may be undermining the soil fertility, especially if it's using these technology packages. I mean, even fertilizers undermine the fertility. By contrast with biofertilizers from animal waste. And it's also undermining food quality in the wealthy areas importing the food. Britain is now producing far less of the food that we eat than it did a half a century ago. And that's partly a result of the common agricultural policy, increasing some kinds of production, in fact, production for export, like grain, and reducing, especially fruit production. And then that has intersected with a neoliberal agri-food policy, which has dominated the governments of this country for at least 4 decades, with the idea, well, it doesn't matter what we produce because we can buy whatever we need from anywhere in the world, and it won't be very expensive. I mean, that has been the dominant assumption. And until recently, at least,
there are many social movements and farmers groups trying to change that assumption. It was always an unjust, environmentally harmful assumption, but now it becomes a dangerous assumption, even a danger to us, as well as a danger to the places that are exporting the food to us.
Okay, thank you so much, Les. Any other question?
And I put the article about London into the chat.
We got
in case you're interested.
Any other question or comment to Les? Not so far as I see. So, and we don't want to exhaust you, Les. I have many questions relevant particularly to your very final comments that resonates a lot with the aims and the scope and what we are looking at the CONEF, but we will continue the discussion at another setting that we are trying to set. I would like to thank you so much, Les. That was really inspiring, very thought-provoking talk, and we brought into the center of the discussion of the local STS community the issue of agroecology and alternative pathways. And this is very important. Thank you so much. I know that you are you are a big friend of Greece. So next time, and this is a promise, I hope to have Les Levidow in person in the department and also for a nice dinner. And according to my information, you know to play Rebetika. So we look forward for this, Les. That's what my informant said.
Alicia. Παίζω το βιολί, νησιώτικα, δωματικά και βρεβέτικα.
Excellent.
And I would even offer to accompany someone in this event who can sing, but the internet has a time delay.
Yes.
Right, which makes it impossible to have synchronous music making through the internet. And of course, this is a big problem for all music groups that wanted to continue practicing during the pandemic. So it will need to be in person.
Yes, indeed.
Whenever that time comes.
And this is a promise. Thank you so much once more. We will continue the discussion. We will keep you updated about the progress of CONEF. Thank you so much for being so supporting and for giving this very nice and thought-provoking talk. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Yes, sir.
And
yes, sir.
Next talk is in December. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Ευχαριστώ για τις ερωτήσεις. Γεια σας.
Bye.